Trauma Therapist Podcast Plus listeners can listen to episodes early and ad-free right now. Become a Plus listener by going to Apple Podcasts, searching for the Trauma Therapist Podcast, and signing up today. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Candice Monson. Candice, welcome.
Welcome to you as well. Thanks for having me.
You are welcome. Appreciate that. So Dr. Monson is professor of psychology at the Toronto Metropolitan University in Toronto. She's one of the foremost experts on traumatic stress and the use of individual and conjoint therapies to treat PTSD. Dr. Monson has published over 150 peer-reviewed publications, 7 books, and 40 book chapters on the development, evaluation, and dissemination of PTSD treatments more generally. Wow. That's pretty amazing. Look,
I'm tired.
Welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
What's your dog's name?
My dog's name is Oliver T. Bear.
Oliver T. Bear. Okay. I'm sure there's a story behind that.
He's my teddy bear.
Awesome. So before we get going, Candice, share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
So I was born in Ulysses, Kansas, which is in Southwest Kansas, in a small town, and did my academic training in the Midwest before then moving to the East Coast, and then eventually, as you mentioned in the opening, to Toronto in Canada.
Okay. All right, let's get into this here. A really impressive background. How did this interest start for you? How did you get into this?
That's I would say that it was really in the latter part of my training when I started working with veterans in a hospital that was focused in a veterans hospital, and really hearing veterans' stories of being in incredibly compromising situations and enduring some tragic situations, and being privileged to hear their stories, but then also by systematically working with them and watching people transform over a relatively short period of time. Mm-hmm. That I caught the bug, honestly, of hearing people's stories, and really, to this day, over 25 years since I graduated, I feel like the luckiest person in the world to actually get the opportunity for people to let me into their lives and trust me.
Right.
To walk along in journeys, to share some of the most vulnerable, intimate details, and to be someone who gets the right to hear that based on their permission, but then also to watch them become better versions of themselves. It's incredible. I have tremendous gratitude for what I get to do.
So you said it wasn't until the latter part of your training. What kind of consumed you in the earlier part, and even what drove you into the field? And we're talking about your training of what? Psychology? What?
So I'm trained as a clinical psychologist.
Okay.
And I would say what probably brought me into psychology was I was born later in life and surrounded by a lot of women who were always talking about, people in their lives and their relationships, and because I was kind of surrounded by that, probably just became better aware of and capable of kind of reading people. So just, and interested in people's stories. Like I am very rarely bored by people. It happens, but it's rare because people and their stories are just really very intriguing to me. And, I think as psychologists and social workers, psychotherapists, et cetera, we all are doing a little bit of research, right? So we have our own adversities that we're working through. And so I think, I'm part of that club, in all honesty, of, searching self and learning about self, but obviously with the goal of trying to help a bunch of other people as well.
So when you initially got into the field, did you have a specific interest?
Well, okay, so this is an interesting part of the story. Speaking of people and their stories. So I started undergraduate. I'm a first generation undergraduate. So my dad was a truck driver. My mom was a housewife. And I went to school to be an accountant because I was really good at math. And as an accountant, I could always have a job. Like that was the sensibilities of where I came from. And what I quickly realized is that accountants, the people I was surrounded by, were kind of like relatively boring. They probably were my people. And what I really loved was putting numbers to human behavior. So there was a term where I was taking like cost accounting, tax accounting, abnormal psychology, and developmental psychology, all at the same time. And I think that's, like, I think of myself first as a clinician, but I'm a clinician who loves math. So it's like putting the metrics and the statistics to what we do and making it a science in terms of how we understand human behavior. So I think that's part of the story too.
Yeah. Where was it that you first encountered or had your first experience working with veterans?
So my first work with veterans was in 1997 at the Boston VA Hospital in the National Center for PTSD. I had definitely encountered people who had been traumatized because trauma is endemic, and had worked. I was a volunteer for the rape crisis domestic violence shelter. That's what it was called at the time, carrying a pager, meeting victims at the hospital. So definitely had an early interest in trauma. But I was a bit more interested in perpetrators of trauma early on in my graduate career. And then when I started working with victims and watching that capacity to change is really what hooked me. And I became really focused on how do we build interventions that actually can work and then get clinicians to deliver them. Like that's been my life work.
What was it about perpetrators? It just reminds me, someone reached out to me on Facebook about a month ago and said, how come you don't have people talking about the perpetrators on your podcast? And actually have, but what was your interest specifically around that?
So I was interested in perpetrators because I think, honestly, if we want to solve the problem of domestic violence and all kinds of assaults, we have to figure out the perpetrators, and we've got to figure out who's amenable to treatment and then what treatment to do. So that's how I got into that. And I went to the University of Nebraska, that's really well known for forensic psychology. So that was part of it.
Interesting.
And I still do some work in that area, but became much more interested in the victims and those who have PTSD in order, just because it's very treatable. Like people can get better. And so it's an area where talk therapy really wins out over medication as well. And so that was compelling. One project that I'm doing that has been super interesting is treating those with PTSD in prisons, who actually, including people who have PTSD related to having perpetrated aggression. And then after the fact, working with someone who, for instance, is part of a gang, and part of gang involvement, actually killed a family member, and all of the guilt and remorse and shame that goes along with that kind of experience. So I think this idea that there are victims and perpetrators is actually a misnomer. Like you can be both at once. They're not orthogonal. And people who have been victimized go on to be perpetrators, and people who perpetrate can be victims. So it's probably foolhardy to think of them as two different things.
That's a very interesting statement. So I'm thinking about the people who are listening who are maybe thinking, well, I've been sexually abused. I'm a victim. I'm not. I mean, maybe I could at some point be a perpetrator, but I'm not a perpetrator now. What are you saying?
Yeah. And it's true that being a perpetrator does not require being a victim. Like, I want to be clear about that. Or that if you're victimized, you're destined to be a perpetrator by any stretch. Right. I take more of an exception to the idea that these things are so clearly like an identity, that it's a simple thing. People are way more complicated than that.
Right.
In terms of their histories, and then, what they can go on to do.
Right. So you had this experience or series of experiences with veterans. You're thinking to yourself, you're drawn to this. How did things unfold such that you started writing these books? And obviously you got so involved in it. How did that unfold? How did that progress?
Dumb luck. There is some dumb luck to it.
Right. But it's one thing to be a therapist or a psychologist and be working with people. And it's another thing to be writing books and chapters and articles and doing research. Right.
Well, it's probably my overachievement problem that needs to be fixed. Here's one part of the answer, I guess, is that I do love to learn. It's funny, as a young kid, the play I always did was teaching. I was always a teacher. And I think from an early age, I was good at school. I love to learn. And I am genuinely just a very curious person. And so I think that very innate part of me then led me to just be attracted to people who are asking some of the best questions and doing the best work. And like, I always felt like I might not have been the smartest person, but I can work hard. And so I found really smart people, and I learned, tried to work with them and learn from them, and then attracted people. It's like a snowball, right?
Yeah,
and you're attracting people who are super smart and building teams of really smart people. But, one thing I've learned in this process is that, smart's a dime a dozen. There are lots of smart people in the world. It's really the good people, finding really good people to work with a passion for what you do, that then makes it possible to be productive, right? So it's not about, I never went into it thinking I'm going to do this many publications, this many books. Like, that was never, it was almost like that was incidental to the process of loving what I was doing. I love what I do. And not everyone loves what they do.
That is certainly true. When you started out and you had mentioned, that PTSD is very treatable, you saw improvements. How were you working with your clients at that point? And how did your understanding and your knowledge of treatments progress?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So keep in mind, this would have been 97, 98. So I started graduate school in 93 at 21, 22. I think I saw my first client at 22 years old, which is like baffling. And at that time, so like say 97, 98 in the VA hospital, like our understanding of PTSD was growing, right? By now it was actually a recognized diagnosis. And there were some systematic attempts to develop treatments and test them, but a lot of the treatment in the VA hospital was what I would say is palliative care, like stress management, anger management, interpersonal skills, a lot of polypharmacy, like trying to basically relieve suffering and minimize the symptoms. And I had a supervisor, Dr. Barbara Niles, shout out to her, who was like, hey, there's this therapy, cognitive processing therapy that Patty Rizek has been testing with female sexual assault survivors. Maybe we should like try it with veterans and, I'll supervise you. And then, this is what I mean. Like, it's one of those incidental let's try this therapy and see how it goes. And then that, struck a whole line of research on cognitive therapies and the idea that actually people could get better. Like at the time, it was like, you have a life sentence. This is like, you're going to always have this condition.
Yeah.
And some people do have the condition forever. Like, I don't suggest that like everyone goes into remission, but a lot of people do get better. And some people do, lose their diagnosis. And I think I was one of many people who are a part of that reformulation of PTSD as a treatable condition, and that it's about recovery from events, not a disorder that develops and stays forever. So that I think has been interesting to observe. And now, one of the topics I talk a lot about is being careful not to fragilize our clients by being afraid to talk about trauma and being afraid to have them go back and systematically go through those experiences to come out the other side. Because if we say, oh, you're not ready, or, we're afraid that you could get worse, like we're kind of sending the message that there's not mastery and competency and capability. And that's been one of the things that I've really, as part of kind of anti-stigma and hope, is to really talk more about our clients being way more capable than we give them.
I mean, with the understanding that, excuse me, everyone is different. There are, there's a lot of talk out there that it's not necessary to review or even talk about, what's occurred. Where does that come into the mix here?
Yeah, I think several things about that. One is that there are improvements that people have from therapies that do not involve going backward, like non-trauma focused therapies. The effects are not as big generally in terms of the improvements, but you can't force anyone to treatment, let alone a certain kind of treatment, right?
Sure.
Like there's always respect for that. And it's all about informed consent, like you ultimately can choose what you want to do. I think what's interesting is that there are a number of ways to go back if you choose to go back. So sometimes people have this conception that to go back is to go back at a really thinly sliced sight, sound, smell, sensory experience. And there are treatments that work that take you back, but it's not at that kind of thin sliced level that seem to work. So there's different roads to Rome.
Sure.
Depends on the path you want to take. So I guess in general, I just get concerned about messaging people they shouldn't talk about their trauma. That's the part that concerns me, because it does seem like people talking about it in a supportive environment is helpful, whether that's with a professional or a loved one.
Right.
And we just don't want to instill this idea that you're going to like somehow taint people or not get better by talking about it.
We've been well, you've mentioned, working with veterans and PTSD within that context. Are you talking about trauma in general, the benefit of talking about it in general, or are you specifically referring to talking in terms of veterans and their experiences?
When about my statements about kind of talking about the trauma is helpful.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm in general. I'm talking more generally, not with particular populations in mind.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I wouldn't recommend wholesale disclosure.
Sure.
Like there are people that, like a trusted person who is going to receive information in a positive way is important too, right? So it's also how you disclose, where you disclose, who you disclose to, that I think be a part of healing. That's really important.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's very interesting because I think there is obviously a sentiment about, use the word fragilizing, and I like that word. And you're saying, well, let's look at this a different way here. I mean, there's something very empowering about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's part of, if I can riff for just a second.
Of course, this is what this is about.
I think it's also part of my concern about trigger warnings, that we've kind of become a bit like trauma phobic. And while I think it is respectful to say, what you're about to watch could be troubling or distressing. Like some preparedness is good. I think if we are constantly treating people as if they shouldn't hear, see, experience things, we're also kind of taking away, stripping that person of their capacity to do it, like kind of devaluing them and their ability to handle it. So I think it's especially when trauma is endemic, it's like over 5% of people have trauma. So just being careful about what message are we sending by saying, don't talk about what happened to you, or, for us to sanitize conversations when it's like, no, really, this is what's happening in the world.
Right.
If it's too sanitary, it's like we may not fully appreciate the impact of what's happening. So I think these are some of the nuances that I've observed in my career.
It's very interesting that you bring that up. There was a recent article, I think it was in the Times, about how certain colleges at the elite level, I know they were talking about, were wondering whether they need to put trigger warnings in the literature that certain. Did you hear about this?
I did hear about this.
Yeah, it was a very interesting article bringing up a lot of what you're talking about. And of course, there were two sides to that story. But
and I think that the fact that let's have a dialogue about that. Like I am pro dialogue.
Right.
Yeah. Like, in fact, I wish, we had more of that dialogue, but I think for me, where I end is this idea that, that there is value in serving things up realistic as they are, to fully understand the impact.
Right. Now, I want to talk about other treatment modalities, but I want to go back when you first started, really encountering or engaging with people who'd experienced trauma. How did that land for you?
Okay, so this is something I think about a lot when because I'm selecting students and I'm training people. I think there is a lot about becoming a trauma therapist that is more about the selection process than teaching people how to hear hard stories. And I think for me, one of the things that's very protective is that I am not a very good imaginer. So, some people, if you hear a story, then it's all of a sudden you have like a very embellished version of it in the mind. I don't at all. So I think that's protective for me in terms of hearing people's stories. Now, that said, there are stories that I've heard at certain points in my life that were really hard to hear. And, I'm not immune, or other people are immune.
Mm-hmm.
I think as a therapist, one of the things that's also protective is that I'm thinking I come to that situation with a certain goal, which is how do I help this person?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, the story's going on and I'm hearing the story, but I'm also thinking about, okay, how do I make this person better given what they're telling me?
Right.
And so you have your mindset on a certain goal, that goal, which is also probably, puts a protection on it as well.
Mm-hmm.
But mostly, I said this before, I'm repeating myself a little bit. I just feel like for someone to tell me the most intimate things that have happened to them and parts where they felt like maybe they did the wrong thing or they reacted in a way that they're ashamed or, wow, how can you not be there and be present and honor that?
Right.
So I think that's mostly my experience about it. It's a gift, it's a precious gift that not everyone gets.
Right. Right. Can you share an early clinical error?
Oh, many.
Yeah. Pick one.
Wow. Okay. So the topic of self-disclosure is always an interesting one, right? And a lot of training programs are, rightfully so, very, I would say, I'm going to use the word dogmatic from the perspective of there's only one right answer, which is never self-disclose. And yet I think there are times where self-disclosure can be incredibly important. And so I was working with a same-sex couple and they were feeling like the system in which they were operating was being very persecutory of them, which in that era probably was true. Anyway, we happened to get on, they took the wrong elevator. It's one of those weird situations. They took the wrong elevator, went up, so they came back down. So I got on the elevator to leave at the same time. And they were like, are you going home to see your husband? And I said, I'm going home to see my wife. And they didn't know that I was in a same-sex relationship at the time. And I thought, oh, that will be joining, they'll think I get them more. And now that they know this piece of information about me, it'll increase the working alliance, blah, 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 blah. It had the opposite effect of, oh my God, you're in a same-sex relationship and you're working in this organization and you're going to get persecuted. They had a very protective, preoccupied response to the whole thing. And probably in the end, the air, all ruptures and repairs that we do in psychotherapy, was probably very helpful because I was able to say, actually, that's kind of not my experience. And to talk about that more and to bring that into the room. But I think it's an error because I wish I would have been more intentional about disclosure. It was one of those popped into the elevator. Someone said,
you went with it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I totally went with it.
Yeah.
I wish I would have been more intentional. And that's what I would say in general about myself as a therapist. Sometimes I just go with it. And then later I'm like, need to prepare it a little bit.
I appreciate you sharing that. I just want to remind everyone, I'm speaking with Dr. Candice Monson. In the bio, I refer to conjoint treatment. Talk about that.
So part of my background was thinking about how we use couple and family therapies to treat individual problems. So that was part of my training. My major advisor was trained as a couple researcher. Anyway, so when I got to the VA, one of the major things that people would say about why they actually got to treatment was their relationship with their partner. And pretty much all mental health conditions will put a lot of wear and tear on relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was kind of born out of that, like a history of training, but then realizing, wow, like this is a major part of what's not working in people's lives that actually brings them. It's like where it hurts. And so then in 2001, started building cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy for PTSD.
Wow.
And yeah, now 22 years later, we have had, let's see, how many trials now? 5 clinical trials and a bunch of case studies and some uncontrolled trials, and been testing it alongside MDMA as an intervention for PTSD. And it's probably, in terms of my contribution to the field, one of my proudest.
Mm-hmm.
Like in terms of being creative. And at the time, people were like, are you crazy? Like, do you really think you can do trauma processing in a couple therapy context? I was like, yeah, let's
so how does it work? I mean, just briefly. Yeah.
Yeah. So the a lot of it is like communication skills and teaching couples to be able to communicate better with each other. But the other part is a lot of these couples with PTSD are very avoidant. And so trying to overcome the avoidance, people, places, situations, and the partner oftentimes is also accommodating those symptoms. And so to work together as a system, as a unit to push against PTSD by approaching.
So is the understanding here that both partners have PTSD?
No, one or both can have PTSD.
Okay.
Yeah, one or both can have PTSD, but they're joining together to work against it, whether it's in one or both of them.
Work against it, meaning perpetuate
working against the disorder. Yeah.
Okay.
So part of what we do is, even in the conceptualization, is externalize the disorder.
Right.
It's not something that's in you. It's something that's living between us.
Wow.
Yeah. And then once we improve the couple's relationship, is then we do cognitive work together, like exploring the cognitions that may be problematic about how the person who has been traumatized has made sense of their trauma, but also potentially how the loved one who's participating may also have some problematic thoughts that are operating. And so we're kind of teaching them critical thinking skills to work together on, in order to address whatever thoughts that we think are maintaining the disorder or causing disorder.
Wow. I don't think I've ever talked about that specifically on this podcast.
Oh, we should talk more about that.
Yeah. I think I'll have to bring you back.
I would love that. Can you tell?
Yes, for a different episode. Can you direct our listeners to perhaps a book you have that would maybe help them in that field, in that topic?
Yeah. So the particular treatment that I was talking about is cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy for PTSD. And it is published by Guilford Press.
Okay. Yep.
So if they Google my name and conjoint therapy for PTSD, I'm sure they would find their way to it.
Okay. And that's harnessing the healing power of relationships?
That's it.
Okay. I will have that linked up.
Yeah. I should say to those who are listening, it is a clinician treatment manual. So some of it, there's nothing that a patient or a loved one couldn't read,
right?
But it is geared toward the readership is for clinicians.
Okay.
There are some amazing resources on the National Center for PTSD website that is specifically about couples and families. and PTSD, and loved ones and caregivers, support givers. So that's va.ptsd.gov.
Okay.
That would be another amazing resource. And there are like some whiteboard videos about the treatment and just some fact sheets, about couples and relationships and PTSD and trauma.
Okay. I'll link that up as well. Well, Candice, you are amazing. I'd love to have you back. Like I said,
I would love to have you back.
Awesome. There's obviously so much to talk about. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Yeah, I would be delighted for people to contact me. Do you want me to give my email here or?
No, I can link it up. I'll link it up for you. Yeah.
They can absolutely contact me via email.
Okay.
If they also go to my website, CandiceMonson.com, there's a contact page as well, as a strategy of getting a hold of me.
Okay.
Either that email or the contact us page on my website would be great.
All right. Awesome. We'll have all
the other thing I could just quickly mention is that we have started a North American online, like virtual mental health center focused on stress and trauma for people who are looking for different options of treatment for PTSD.
Wow.
It's called Nellie Health. So just to put a plug in for Nellie as well. Okay.
Where is that on your website?
I don't think there's a link from CandiceMonson.com, but NellieHealth.com. NELIE health.com.
Okay. Nellie Health. I'll put that here too. Awesome. Candice, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure.
All right.
I hope to come back again.
It was awesome. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.